I'm going to represent a hypothetical case for Arabic on this pew. The first thing I want to do is go to Google Images and pull up something to compare the markings to. So I'm going to type in Surat and Nas calligraphy. And I'll just choose this top middle image. So this is the 114th chapter of the Quran, the last chapter of the Quran according to its current organization. And I'm going to skip past the top portion, which has the basmala and the first verse of the chapter, and I'm just going to focus on this portion right here, which has the second and third verses of the chapter. The portion on the right is from verse 2, and it reads, Maliki Nas, the ruler of mankind. Now, I'm not really going to be looking at this verse in this video, but it will have some minor relevance towards the end. My main focus is going to be on the portion on the left, which is the third verse, which reads, Ilahi Nas, the God of mankind. I'll be comparing this Quranic text to what appears on the particular pew we are examining in the video. So, returning to the pew, I'd like to first look closely at this portion here. You have this portion that hooks upward, and then there's sort of a dot above that hook. So with that in mind, pulling back, this portion here looks to me like an Arabic nun alif. It looks like a sort of hook, but with a dot above the shorter portion. And when looking at the Quranic text that we pulled up, a nun alif appears right here. Returning to the pew, the next portion I would like to focus on is the portion on the left. Notice this portion here sort of goes downward, then raises up a little bit, then drops a bit again and rises again, almost as if it's forming something like a W. Can you see that? As we pull back now, notice that portion that it also has another part that hooks off dramatically to the left. And therefore, I would propose that this looks like an Arabic final scene. And as we return to our Quranic verse, we find precisely that character, the Arabic character scene, final scene specifically, in that, basically that same spot. And this gives us the Arabic word nas, which means mankind. In my first video on a hypothetical case for Arabic on this pew, I also showed this calligraphic form of the name of the chapter, Surat an-Nas, and I highlighted the word Nas in that as well for the sake of comparison. The next portion that I'd like to focus on is this line here. Here I would propose that this looks a bit like an Arabic alif. Returning to the Quranic text, we find an alif in this position here. Now, the next portion I want to look at on the pew is this portion right here. On a hypothetical case for Arabic in this pew, I showed this calligraphic rendering of the same chapter, and I noted that the word ilah is rendered like this, with that hook on the top right. So, in the Quranic text we have been looking at, I would propose that this could correspond to this portion here, where you see the arrow pointing to. This portion is actually two characters, lam, ha. I'd propose here that the hook in the corresponding marking on the pew could just be a more dramatic rendering of the lam in lam, ha. So on this interpretation, we now have two words. On the right, we have alif lam ha, spelling the word ilah, which means God. On the left, we have nun alif sin, spelling the word nas, which means mankind. But what about those two lines right in between those two words? Well, returning to the Quranic text, the only portion that has not been highlighted in the verse is, well, in specifically verse 3, is precisely the two lines between the word ilah and the word nas. This portion here, two lines forming the definite article, alif, lam. So, on the pew, I'm going to highlight those two little lines and interpret them as an alif lam, the definite article on the word nas, forming the word an-nas, the mankind, the humanity. So now we have the full Quranic verse reading Ilahi Nas, the God of mankind. And at this point, those familiar with Arabic will be within their rights to note that that's a very short alif and lam in what's being proposed as a definite article for an-nas. For that reason, this would probably be it's probably the most curious portion of this interpretation of the pew. But remember that these allegedly man-made markings were made specifically by slaves. You see, the pews were built by slaves, and it's claimed that the same slaves who built the pews also made the markings on the pews. Now, assuming that's true, with that in mind, I'd like to turn to this document, which is currently displayed at the University of Pennsylvania. I'll share a link in the video description. This is a text which a slave in Haiti wrote in the 1700s. What you see here was the slave's attempt to write the Arabic text of the 112th chapter of the Quran from memory. Now, this is helpful because not only because it's an example of Arabic written by a slave in the Americas, but more specifically because it's from the shorter, easier to memorize suwar or chapters at the end of the Quran. See, I'm proposing a hypothetical case for a portion of the 114th chapter of the Quran on the relevant pew, and here we see the 112th chapter of the Quran. Both these chapters are part of a collection of very short chapters at the end of the Quran, which many Muslims find relatively easy to memorize. Moreover, this text shows a real-world example of how when a slave in the Americas wrote one of those shorter Qur'anic chapters from memory, there could arise, I'll try to put this delicately, there could arise curious features that might strike a student of Arabic as respectfully perhaps being indicative of the writer not being fully attentive to the alifs and lams in the text that they were attempting to reproduce from memory. First, note that in the basmala, the word Allah is missing a lam. It's spelled alif lam ha rather than alif lam lam ha, with two lams. In fact, every single time the word Allah appears in this text, it's spelled this way, as you'll see as we go through it. Also note that the alif and lam in Allah here are shorter than the ba, which begins the basmala. As we move more into the text, note that the alif in the definite articles of both ar-Rahman and ar-Rahim are not visible, seemingly sublimated into the lams of those titles. Then, as we move beyond the basmala into the first verse of the chapter, note that the word ahad does not have a visible alif, and I'd propose that the same is the case when the word ahad appears again at the end of this chapter in this particular rendering. So, moving on to the next verse, the lam in as-samad is part of the definite article in as-samad is not visible. Perhaps it's been sublimated into the character sad. Now, after that phrase, Allah as-samad, the text becomes less clear, but I'd like to jump to the last verse, or better put, the fourth verse, which reads, وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. On a side note, it's curious that both yakun and kufua seem to be spelled with a qaf rather than a kaf, but I want to focus on the word lahu. Notice how short the lam is in lahu. It is very, very short. And meanwhile, the lam at the start of the verse is dramatically long. The point of this look at the text is to note that we have a real-world example of a slave in the Americas writing one of the shorter suwar from the end of the Quran and from memory. And we see that when this happened, the approach to specifically alifs and lams does not always seem consistent, or, because it has different lengths and perhaps even different styles at different points. So, returning to the pew we were looking at, yes, on this proposed reading, the alif lam of the definite article for an-nas is very short. But we also know that this phenomenon would not be unprecedented for slaves in the Americas writing shorter Qur'anic suwar from memory. That said, there's still a portion on this pew that we have not addressed, and that's the portion here on the right. This raises a question. If the markings highlighted in red produce the Qur'anic phrase ilahin nas, What is this marking to the right of that phrase? Well, returning to our Qur'anic text, note what precedes the verse we've been looking at, which is to say, we've been looking at verse 3. However, recall that verse 2 reads Malikin Nas, which is to say, it also ends with the word an-nas, which ends with an Arabic final scene. With that in mind, let's take another look at the marking on the right of the pew. It does indeed look like an Arabic final scene. Now, think about the implications of this. If my proposed reading is correct, we could even expect that portion to be flanked by the letter seen on both sides. And lo and behold, the very markings look precisely like instances of the Arabic letter seen. Honestly, that's an amazing coincidence. The string of characters I have proposed is extremely well attested. It's from one of the most well-known and most memorized Arabic texts in human history. Now, at this point, I imagine someone will want to ask if any scholars back this Arabic interpretation of this pew. In this section, we will look at a few other scholars. Now, in my case, I just wanted to discuss the markings on the pews. I'm fine with others inviting scholars to weigh in and share what they feel appears on a given pew. However, with both scholar and student alike, I would want a person who claims to have found discernible language in a pew to point to the precise markings they have in mind and to transcribe what they feel appears therein. What I did not want is for someone to declare that a scholar said some language appears in there somewhere and now the matter is closed. As I've said in a previous video, a university professor is not a high priest who puts forth dogma that can never be questioned. That's simply not how academia works, and no scholar would say that once they speak, no student can ever ask questions or raise objections or investigate the matter for themselves. Again, that's not how academia works. Whatever the case, I decided that, I can at least send out a few emails to a few different professors. And that's what I did. To each professor I wrote to, I sent 2 images. The first image I attached was of this particular pew from this angle. The second image which I attached to each email was this one, which is the same pew, just with some highlights added to guide the eyes, so to speak. Along with those images, I sent each professor the exact same email text, which read as follows, quote, "Forgive the intrusion of this email. In Savannah, Georgia, USA, there is a church, First African Baptist Church, which has pews which were built by slaves. On the outside of the pews which those slaves built are a number of markings. Some have claimed that the markings might be Hebrew, and others have claimed that the markings might be Arabic. Recently, someone has suggested that one pew might even have material from the Quran, but the person who made that suggestion is not any sort of expert in Qur'anic Arabic. I am writing to ask if you might offer some insight here. I have attached 2 images. The first image simply shows a pew unhighlighted. The second image shows the same pew with highlights as part of one person's attempt to elucidate what might be there. Nota bene, the portion on the right in the second image is in a different color because one person suggested that it might be the end of a different sentence. Could you tell me if, in your opinion, that looks to you or to any of your colleagues like it could be Hebrew, or if it looks like it could be Arabic, and if it might be the latter, if there is any possibility of it resembling anything in the Quran, and if you feel there might be any discernible language in the markings, whether Hebrew or Arabic or something else, are you or anyone you know able to suggest a possible translation? Apologies again for the intrusion. Thanks in advance for any help in this matter. Sincerely, AA." End quote. So I received multiple replies, and the first email that I'd like to show is the reply I received from Samar Ali, professor of Arabic at the University of Michigan. His response reads as follows, quote, "Thanks for reaching out, and this is super interesting. It looks like Arabic in the West African script, and it could very well be a 3-word snippet of chapter 114 of the Quran, which nearly every Muslim would know and use for ritual prayer. I can't be certain without more context, but it looks like al-Nas, Ilahil Nas, humanity, the God of humanity, from the middle of that chapter. The whole text of chapter 114 is very short. In the name of God, merciful to all, compassionate to each, I seek refuge with the Lord of humanity, the King of humanity, the God of humanity, who whispers in the hearts of humanity, of jinn and humanity. Besides prayer, it's used in stressful or frightening situations to summon God's protection. Let me know if I can be of any further help. end quote. So while this professor, Samar Ali, said he is not certain, he does say that it looks like it could be a West African rendering of a few words from the last chapter of the Quran, precisely the chapter I had appealed to when I proposed an Arabic reading for this pew. Also worthy of note, his point that this text was memorized and recited in particular by those in stressful or frightening situations could loan itself well to the idea of this being a text which certain slaves had memorized. Now let me show you another couple of emails, with in particular one with a more definitive answer. This one is from Geoffrey Khan, who is the current Regius Professor of Hebrew at Cambridge in England. The Regius Professor, or Regius if you want, you can say Regius. The Regius Professorship of Hebrew at Cambridge is a Hebrew chair established by the King of England 480 years ago. So this is a serious Hebraist, and he also studies and teaches Arabic. So Professor Khan's initial reply to my email was as follows, quote, "Thank you very much for your message and for the photos of the pews in Savannah. The writing is Arabic and contains verses 2 and 3 from the final chapter or surah of the Quran. The text visible in the photo reads in Arabic, Sovereign of mankind, the God of mankind. When do you think this was written on the pews? Was it written by the slaves who built it? Best wishes, Geoffrey," end quote. So I wrote back to Professor Khan with the following, quote, "Greetings, Professor Khan. Thank you very much for your reply. Regarding your question, I do not know for certain when the markings were made. The only thing I have is the church's oral tradition, which posits that the same slaves who made the pews were the ones who made those markings. Ergo, assuming that is correct, the markings would date to the 1850s. I really appreciate you sharing your conclusion regarding what appears in those markings. Forgive me if this question is somewhat redundant, but just to be clear, would you say it is definitely Arabic and not Hebrew? The context of my question is the alternate suggestions which have floated around, some positing that the markings should be Arabic and others positing that the markings should be Hebrew. Sincerely, AA," end quote. In response to that, Professor Khan wrote a second reply, which read in part as follows, quote, "The writing is clearly Arabic and is clearly from the Quran, the final surah, Surat al-Nas. It is certainly not Hebrew," end quote. Now, seeing how Richardson, Brown, and others treated the alleged positions of Bunis and Katz, can you imagine how they would react if Cambridge's Hebrew chair said that the markings are clearly Hebrew and certainly not Arabic? I think we can all agree that they would declare that the debate is finished and the matter is closed. So this begs the question, now that I have an email from Cambridge's Regius Professor of Hebrew saying that the markings are clearly Arabic and certainly not Hebrew, should I play the same game? Should I say that the debate is closed and that mere students cannot say anything in response? Of course not. The reason why is because, as I said, that is not how academia works. No scholar would want me going around telling people that they cannot ask questions, or that they cannot raise objections, or that they cannot investigate the matter for themselves. This email does not have to end the discussion, and it especially should not be a tool, used to try to silence students of language. And, to drive this point home, let me share a third email. This one is from Mohsen Gudarzi, an assistant professor of Near Eastern Studies at the University of Minnesota. His email takes a different approach. His email reads in part as follows, quote, "Thank you for your email. I've looked at the images carefully, and I don't believe they contain Arabic writing. Now, it is not impossible for the markings to represent a highly cursive, idiosyncratic, and or local form of Arabic script. Someone with expertise in West African Islam could be a better judge of this. Nor is it impossible to read into them certain recognizable phrases from the Quran. I can read into them 2 phrases, in fact. But these would constitute imposition of a text upon the markings, which can be done basically with any set of sufficiently complex traces," end quote. Now, I imagine at this point, some might be thinking, wait, what? Why would you share that email? You should have ended it with the email from the professor at Cambridge. But I would prefer that we at least try to be somewhat intellectually honest. Moreover, I think Professor Gudarzi's email is helpful. There is a real possibility of an imaginative mind making connections based on familiar features and patterns while looking at something which is actually random or naturally occurring. And one can read up on, things like pareidolia and apophenia for more on this possibility. Finally, let's be honest. What sorts of replies we might get from certain professors can also be influenced by what precise images are shown, how those images are highlighted, and how the questions are worded. So there are multiple layers of interpretation and influence at play in these exercises. For example, try writing to different professors with this image, without any highlights, noting that some claim Hebrew appears on the pew and others claim Arabic appears on the pew, while also clearly saying up front that one other possibility is that these are just random or naturally occurring markings, like medullary rays or scratches, made at random. I think we all know that we're unlikely to get too many replies declaring that to clearly be Hebrew or Arabic if that approach is taken. On that note, I hope everyone enjoyed this discussion on the recent appeals to scholars, and I really am looking forward to the comments of others, and I'm looking forward to see where this discussion goes from here. On that note, God bless.